Book 28 of 2020 was 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I'm trying to read that backwards then. So I was recommended to read this book by two random people that I met in Fiji. I was on holiday with my friend and his friend, and at the time I don't think that I read that much. I think I probably read like a book a month, if that. And I was aware of books because of my degree, so I did half my degree in English literature, but I'd kind of, because the majority of my degree was psychology, I only selected kind of like Victorian literature as a module, and the other modules were kind of just like, you know, Shakespeare, and you know, I think there was a postmodern one where I did a little bit of like Neil Gaiman and you know, Wide Sargasso Sea, Jean something she was called. So I did quite a few different books, and was aware of those, but I didn't really kind of know about like world literature. And obviously this is kind of revered as being part of the Latin American canon, which I found out recently. And I didn't really enjoy it that much. It took me about 3 months to read this book because I kept putting it down. Like the second half of it, I read in like a couple of days, maybe a day, 2 days. Whereas the rest of it, it took me like 3 months because I just like kept picking it up, putting it down. I was just so bored all the way through the first half of it. And I understand why it's kind of revered in the sense that they've got this kind of incorporation of magic, this magical realism. It's almost kind of like discussed in a way that's quite mundane. And so, I mean, as a modern reader, I kind of just accepted that there was magic in this place. Like I didn't really read it as if it was like a time like now. I kind of just imagined that it was a world where there was magic and there was magic carpets. Like I just didn't even question it. It was just like, yeah, whatever. But I imagine that people, when they first read that, particularly like maybe in Latin America, I don't know, like I guess that it probably is like a book that's probably made an entrance into that, outside of things like, I was going to say sci-fi, but ghosts aren't really science fiction, are they? But anyway, I can understand why that is revered for that reason. And also there's kind of a representation of history that's more from the perspective of the oppressed rather than the oppressor. So I thought that was really, really interesting because obviously Latin America has been colonized, and so that was an interesting kind of angle to it. So because Marquez is trying to show kind of like a repetition of history and how, you know, history just repeats itself over and over throughout the generations and they kind of make the same mistakes, and also to kind of show that like elites kind of have like a self-love, which I read into because I didn't really pick up on that. Marquez uses a repetition of names, so like everybody is called either I can't even say the word because I've read it and I've not pronounced it. I can't remember how to say it. José Arcadios is one of them, which I'm probably not saying right, and Aureliano is the other, and they're all called that. And so it's so confusing, and they all have a similar personality as well, which is, you know, Marquez is representing the, you know, futile fatalism of life, and that, you know, you're almost like destined to repeat what your ancestors did. And I understand why the names are similar, because from an elitist perspective, you give your children the same name as you, and it kind of carries down in that way. So it's showing that kind of self-love and that egocentrism, which I read into later on. But I kind of took from it when I was reading it that it was that kind of repetition of, like, it doesn't really matter how many generations there are, you kind of just, you're almost like the same person again, repeating what the other person did from the generations. And it was funny because I started thinking to myself how I was quite similar in personality to like some people in my family who were older, and you don't really know until you actually speak about it. Like I realised that I actually am quite like a lot of my aunties, but I didn't realise, like I just thought I was weird, but apparently we're all weird. So it's really nice to kind of be around them and think, oh, they do the weird stuff that I do, and I didn't even know this. So it's obviously like a trait that's handed down through the generations, you know. So you can kind of see that, but because they've all got the same name and they've all got the same personalities, it's really, really difficult to understand like who's who, and it's really confusing to know how they're all connected because there's so many generations. Luckily there is like a family tree in the beginning. Let's try and see if I can find it for you to have a look at. So there's the family tree, but it's still really confusing because, you know, at one, like this one here, there's 17 of these guys, and there's kind of like crosses where like one woman gets pregnant by two of the brothers, and so it's like, what? And there's loads of incest that's going on, and it's like, what? Like obviously, like in olden days, like, you know, cousins kind of marry each other, which I think what Marcus is trying to kind of like show is that, you know, within elites, like the cousins marry and it's incest, and yet it's still, you know, they're deemed to be elite, but they're incestuous. You know, keeping the blood within the lines, if you will. You know, the blue blood. So it's almost kind of like, I guess, a mockery of that, because there's this fear that the children are going to have like the tail of a pig, which transpires eventually as it goes through because they forget about it. So yeah, it is quite confusing, and this kind of idea as well of kind of fatalism and everything being futile is represented a few times. There's quite a lot of symbolism. So there's Colonel Aureliano, the first brother. He kind of creates these goldfish, and then he kind of melts them down again and then creates them again. In fact, is it him or is it the other one that's after him? I think it might be him. Yeah, they've all got the same personality, so it's like it's the same person just repeating again. And there's also kind of like wars between conservatives and liberals, and it kind of like goes on and on like all the time, and just it's on kind of like a loop and on a repetition, and nothing changes. Like there's no impact from it. There's just loads of people that have been shot and killed and have died, and it just kind of shows the futility of kind of war. But it also shows how conservatives are kind of always in power, but they're not in power in a way that's beneficial to everybody. There's always kind of like people that are disadvantaged by that kind of power structure, which is classic conservative ideology, isn't it? And there's kind of almost like a hint towards how if you forget history, it's going to be repeated, and that often it's those that are in power that manipulate what's remembered of history, which is what I was mentioning before about this kind of othering, and it being from the perspective of the othering, of the others, because there's a whole kind of thing that happens about this banana this banana company, and it kind of discusses, I mean, I wasn't really kind of aware of Latin America and plantations and things like that, but it's something that I became aware of when I was searching something else, and it's kind of showing how all the history to do with that has been manipulated, and there's been lots of people that have been killed and all kind of things like that has been whitewashed and just not kind of owned up to, because once everyone's died and no one remembers it, they can tell people what they want, which is what happens in history. And so I think actually reading around this book and understanding more about it and what kind of like the critical analysis of it is, it kind of makes sense how it's written. And I get that makes it kind of a classic, and it's kind of literary in that way. And so I imagine that people will like it for those reasons, but it were boring and it was confusing. And so for that reason, I wouldn't recommend it to read. And I've actually got another one of his called Love in the Time of Cholera, which was nominated for the book club before I joined it, and a lot of them were saying that it's not very good. And the only reason why I bought it was because when I was getting my hair cut, this hairdresser said that I reminded her of a character in it because I had long ginger hair, but apparently this character is a prostitute, which obviously all women in those days with ginger hair are prostitutes, you know, that's just the way it was. But yeah, I don't think that I'm, you know, rushing to read that book, basically, let's put it that way. So whilst this might be revered, I think like most classics, they might be very good and they might have lots of themes and they might be very well written, but they're boring. So I wouldn't recommend it to read.